PlayStation was once the go-to destination for all things games. They had their finger on the pulse of what people wanted to see until eventually the PS5 generation happened. And since then, PlayStation's influence in the global marketplace has dwindled in terms of relevance amidst the physical media debacle, the focus on westernized IPs that aren't selling like they used to, and a push for live service content models over making single-player games like before. This will be a different kind of video from me, but I want to talk about the man behind all of this, Hermen Hulst, the man who killed PlayStation. Let's get into it. Herman Hulst was born into a family of entrepreneurs. From a very early age, he was always pushed by his family to seek things at a greater level than those around him. His first job in games was at Ubisoft, where Herman worked as a video games market analyst. There, he would understand how the whole industry worked, figuring out the best path forward until eventually Herman would begin as a consultant for game companies instead. He did this for a bit until eventually he would join a group called Lost Boy Games in 2001. It was here that Herman would take his love for games and would hyper-focus it into creating actual video games instead of analyzing them instead. Lost Boys was a studio that emerged from 3 other Dutch studios into a single entity. Lost Boys would also eventually lose one of its founders, and Herman Hulst would step up and fill the role of executive director at this newly formed Dutch studio. In 2003, Lost Boys would be acquired by another company, but they would also change their name. This was when Lost Boys would become known as we know them today as Guerrilla Games. Herman Hulst would become a co-founder of Guerrilla Games, and within this time frame, Guerrilla would release their very first game under this newly formed merger of Dutch studios. That game would become known as Killzone. Killzone was touted also as the Halo killer. It would be a tentpole title for PlayStation's push into first-person shooters because, obviously at the time, Bungie was controlling the market share with the release of Halo 1 and Halo 2. This would then lead to Sony and Guerrilla Games' partnership forming in 2005. Herman Hulst would eventually become even further integrated into the very fibers of what made Guerrilla Games what they are today. He would oversee everything. Herman was also responsible for pushing Guerrilla into creating its own engine to further enhance the Killzone experience for their players. This engine would eventually become known as the Decima engine. You know Death Stranding 1 and 2? Yeah, Hideo Kojima went visiting PlayStation-owned studios, and he was deciding before game development began which engine he was going to use for his own games that he would make in-house. Well, Decima became his choice because it was and still is an amazing piece of technology. Decima engine powered lies in its ability to blend photorealism visuals with open-world game-like experiences. It would also have amazing optimization that prioritized performance over literally anything else. Not only that, but character models would have very high fidelity, the likes of which most games around that time could only hope of achieving to a similar degree like Decima could. Guerrilla Games would also use Decima to their advantage. I mean, even looking at Killzone 2, which was released on the PlayStation 3. Killzone 2 looks incredible even by today's standards, so much so that you could re-release that game now on PS5 with little to no visual enhancements, and you could probably pass it off as a brand new game, because Decima is incredible. Again, go look at Death Stranding 2's facial animations and environments to see why. They're beautiful, right? That's the power of Decima. And yes, credit where it's due, Herman Hulst was a part of the development of that engine, and it's still being used even to this day for a very good reason. It's probably one of the best engines out there. Again, I just bring up Killzone 2 as a great example of this, right? The game, as you're seeing on screen, it looks amazing. I remember playing Killzone 2 way back when and being blown away by how good it looked. I'm honestly surprised the Killzone franchise as a whole has been left behind by Sony and Guerrilla. A collection of these games visually enhanced for PS5 and the eventual PS6 would be a great seller. Even the PS Vita spin-off Killzone Mercenary was really well done too. That game was very fun and had a compelling gameplay loop where you hunted Hellghast and other criminals for money to spend on upgrades to make yourself a stronger bounty hunter. PlayStation needs to bring back those games at least in a collection, but as you'll see as we go, Herman Hulst eventually will turn heel and begin changing PlayStation into something it was never meant to be, but we'll get there. Going back to the timeline, around this time, Killzone 2 was being pushed even harder as the Halo killer, which graphically at least, it definitely outdid Bungie's engine by a long shot, but it was mostly smoke and mirrors. As Killzone 2, which cancelled its PS2 version for PS3 instead, would fall into backlash, because Guerrilla and Sony could not match the CGI pre-rendered trailers that Sony was pushing to market their PlayStation 3 console, which was their future at the time. And while true, Killzone 2 couldn't match the CGI spectacle Sony pushed in its marketing, the game still was, by and large, a beautifully made game. It was the bread and butter of its time. Brown and gray environments, everything gritty and dark, hyper violence, and lots of gruff men yelling at each other as bullets flew in every direction. Killzone would continue with a third installment, and when the PlayStation 4 would release, release, Killzone Shadowfall was also released day one with the console, which I did play. It was a fine game, not amazing or anything. It sold okay, not amazing either, but it sure did look good and displayed the PS4's performance at the time. But after decent sales that were dwindling, it became clear that Killzone was never going to defeat Halo or the much bigger growing status of Call of Duty, which after Modern Warfare in 2007, well, it changed everything. Therefore, Hermen and Guerrilla Games pivoted in a new direction. They decided around 2010, before Shadowfall released and 3 years before the PS4 would even launch, that they would need a new direction overall. This is when internally at Guerrilla Games, they gave their employees the ability to pitch new ideas for some sort of franchise. The studio's art director, whose name is Jan Bart van Beek, submitted his idea, which involved a young woman with fiery red hair in a post-apocalyptic environment, hunting robotic dinosaurs with a bow and arrow. After almost 30 submissions by its staff, this idea became the clear winner. Hermen Hulst would then spearhead this game's concept and presented it to Sony's leadership, which at this point Guerrilla Games was already a first-party studio at Sony PlayStation. And this game would eventually be greenlit, and Guerrilla Games would create the series to what we know now as Horizon Zero Dawn. That fiery redhead would now be named Aloy, a backstory about malicious robots ending humanity and AI godlike beings turning the Earth into like a simulation, almost playground that these robotic minds would terraform became the basis of its story. Aloy would then become the new face of Guerrilla Games, built of course on Decima engine, which had been reiterated many times over from the very first Killzone all the way to now, and thus Horizon was born. Horizon Zero Dawn would exceed all expectations, despite being released very closely to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which dominated the conversation online. But even then, Horizon sold very well. As of 2023, the first Horizon game would reach somewhere around 20 to 24 million copies sold officially. Yes, many of these copies sold were bundled with the sales of brand new PlayStation 4s, which wouldn't really diminish Horizon's success. It actually meant that the game was being used by Sony PlayStation as a showcase title to new PlayStation owners as to why this was their future. The rise of Horizon Zero Dawn brought Guerrilla Games to a new level. They were seen now as a tentpole of Sony's first-party studio's design philosophy, and because of this, Hermen Hulst was then offered a role not at Guerrilla, but at Sony proper due to the success of Horizon Zero Dawn. It was also around this time that Sony's westernized side of the business was absolutely doing gangbusters. The Last of Us had sold millions of copies, captured everyone's hearts, won Game of the Year. Horizon Zero Dawn became the face of the PS4 movement, and during this time, God of War's next game, led by Cory Balrog, which brought Kratos to Norse mythology, would also be doing gangbusters in sales as well, even winning Game of the Year at the Game Awards. It became very clear to Sony in this very moment that to them, the westernized side of their business, and not the eastern one which they built their values upon, was where they would now cement their beliefs and become the future of their entire corporation. Oh boy, here we go. This was why in 2019, Hermen Hulst would eventually leave Lost Boy Games, now known as Guerrilla Games, behind after working there for almost 20 years. Having made the Killzone and now Horizon franchises for Sony, PlayStation wanted Hermen Hulst to lead game development for all future first-party Sony games and then on. This is when Shuhei Yoshida, who had been at Sony since its inception with the PlayStation 1 in the 90s, would step down and be replaced by Hermen Hulst instead. This was seen as the turning point for PlayStation. This was when Sony, under the visionary direction of Hermen Hulst, would become the new gods of modern video games, or so they thought anyways. Stuff like Horizon Forbidden West would be created during this time, a bizarre game really, where Aloy's personality would go from curious and honestly interesting to just kind of feeling robotic and downright emotionless at times. Suddenly everyone in Horizon's sequel who was in a position of power besides a few would be very evidently women only. Now there were various diverse body types, and representation would also be implemented in the sequel game all over, and Hermen, believing still that Horizon was the future blueprint of PlayStation, began greenlighting other games under Horizon's name, like the VR title Horizon Call of the Mountain, or a weird Horizon Lego spin-off game meant for kids which did not sell well at all. And now due to its failure, you can play that game on PlayStation Plus's catalog if you want to. To this day, I still don't understand who thought a Lego version of Horizon was the move, but Hermen clearly did. Horizon became Hermen's legitimacy. He would push it in any way that he could. Horizon Forbidden West also became one of the newest examples of Sony's turn to now pushing female-led hero stories. Aloy had become an insufferable feminist archetype. Her sexuality was now changed to being gay, despite in the previous game, the player could actually choose male or female options for Aloy, but in the sequel, oh no. Aloy was now the feminist hero. Its world felt sanitized, and even despite Forbidden West not selling how Zero Dawn did, and funnily enough, yet again again, history repeating itself because Forbidden West came out around the same time as Elden Ring of all things, Herman, now the head of Sony Studios, believed this was still the future, and he would double down, and oh, he would double down. Horizon Lego Adventures, for example, even released on PC and Nintendo Switch. Despite this, the sales faltered, and because of Herman being involved, he was a part of the decision to push Sony's first-party titles away from PlayStation, and instead start porting them to platforms like PC. Believing that Sony's games would be better by offering them on rival platforms, it worked sort of, but overall the push for Sony's first-party titles onto PC did nothing really but make the core fantasy of owning a PlayStation seem rather worthless whatsoever, honestly. Cause why own a PlayStation 4 or 5 if every game exclusive to it could be playable on Steam? Despite this, Herman and his team, they pushed for Spider-Man, Horizon, God of War, and other heavy hitters to all be ported over anyways. We now know after this experiment that this push to PC did not work for PlayStation. Sales were lackluster because the games were releasing a full year or two after their hype cycles, if you will, and generally speaking, releasing these games damaged PlayStation's entire reason for existing, which was exclusivity. This wouldn't be the end of Hermen Hulst making bad decisions at Sony, as he's also greenlit other games as well, all surrounding, you guessed it, Horizon yet again. God help me, this includes an MMO called Horizon Steel Frontiers, because who wouldn't want to play an MMO in the same world as Aloy? Thankfully, this MMO is being developed at least by NCSoft, an Asian development studio, but generally speaking, do I think the players out here want a Horizon MMO? Not really, no. This also includes another game close to Herman called Horizon Hunter's Gathering, because why stop there when you could also make a Monster Hunter clone that's also live service, where Horizon's world is now cartoony and further pushes diversity and the like as well. If you couldn't tell, I personally think all of this is way too much Horizon content, and I do not think the world actually cares this much about Horizon as much as Herman does. Zero Dawn was an anomaly because it was new, but also because Zero Dawn at least wasn't poisoned by the modernity that had completely eclipsed and strangled every facet of Sony's first-party game design, especially in the West. Hermen Hulst would also spearhead another project, which he would call internally his Star Wars. This game would combine Sony's desire for live service elements with a brand new, exciting science fiction universe full of aliens and amazing powers. This idea would become known as Concord, and Hermen Hulst believed so deeply in this IP that it would work that he pushed Sony to develop multimedia projects surrounding the release of Concord to elevate this game like he did Horizon. This is how much faith he had in it. Herman genuinely believed that Concord was the future of PlayStation, a game that combined live service elements with westernized modernity and diverse body types and characters as well. This was going to be the future of Sony PlayStation and a tentpole release in their pivot to live service game development. All of these elements and more were designed with Herman at the center of its push. Concord was incubated internally at Firewalk Studios, which Herman also pushed Sony to acquire, as he believed the studio, which was made up of ex-AAA developers from across the industry, would also become the bedrock for Sony's multiplayer future. Concord would also cost Sony upwards of $400 million to develop, which Hermen Hulst, now in his swanky office with a chip on his shoulder to prove to everyone he knew what PlayStation needed, gladly signed and kept doing so. After years in development and setbacks behind the scenes, Concord, the future of Sony and Herman's own version of Star Wars for the next generation, would finally release. The game would arrive with a thunderous, crashing nothingness instead of the roaring applause that Herman expected, like with Horizon. The game did poorly right out of the gate, actually underselling that. Its player numbers were horrendous. The character designs were the antithesis of what any player really wanted. It's usually a good gauge of whether a game has staying power or not, based on the fact if people who cosplay a game's character before they even play the game, but in Concord's case, no one cosplays a single character. There wasn't even any rule you-know-what artwork of any of Concord's cast, which meant that even the gooners out here, who will pretty much draw just about anything with massive milkers or bodacious behinds, were steering clear of Concord like it was a digital plague. The game would release, and it would get crucified. It had pronouns and bio for every character in its select screen. Unironically, its cast was diverse, from a fat guy in a blue jacket named Daw, or an old grandma with gray hair and wrinkles, because yeah, that's who cosplayers want to cosplay as Herman. Great idea there. To say that Concord was a disaster is an understatement to disasters. It was like 5 atom bombs being dropped on Sony's headquarters all at once with how poorly that game went. Nobody cared about it. It was everything wrong with modern games, and at the height of the pandering era, Concord, which again was meant to be PlayStation's Star Wars, ended up being seen more like its Spaceballs instead. And Hermen Hulst was devastated. Concord would be taken offline not even 2 weeks after release. The game would be refunded, all services would cease, and Sony would lay off the entirety of Firewalk Studios while pulling Concord from their storefronts as a tax write-off to recoup the losses. Despite this catastrophic failure, which was arguably the biggest flop in the history of Sony PlayStation, and should have been the moment that Sony pivoted away from live service and Hermen's control, they kept him in power anyways. Which to this day has been a mistake in my opinion, because any lesser position at Sony, they would have been fired and blacklisted, but Hermen? No, he was kept. I guess he must know where the bodies are buried, otherwise this frankly makes no sense. Regardless, what Hermen was representing was a shift at PlayStation. He was trying to turn what was once a single-player focused corporation, ironically, what Hermen's entire rise to fame was based on with Killzone and Horizon, given what those games were, and instead then tried to turn the entire company's vision into something it never was or really could be. One of the only success stories under Hermen was Helldivers 2, and likely due to the success of that game, Hermen rode the goodwill of Helldivers 2 like it was the only raft at sea as the Titanic sunk in front of everyone else that was Concord. Sure, he helped create their biggest blockbuster disaster ever, but he also helped create their greatest live service push in a game too. So it was a double-edged sword that would cost millions of dollars, time, and energy. Sony since then has greenlit something close to 20 live service games. Of the games released, only 2 still exist in a playable state, Helldivers 2 and Marathon. However, Marathon is likely going to cease development soon too, given its catastrophic numbers, another blunder that cost millions for Sony under Hermen's watchful eye. Yet somehow, despite all of this, he's still there, guiding the future of PlayStation. Under Hermen, many games like Spider-Man 2 and more also began working with consulting companies that players have grown to despise, and many of Sony's first-party studios' flagship titles have also all begun to pivot in some direction towards female-led franchises only. God of War would replace Kratos with Lao Fei, Ratchet & Clank introduced Rivet, a multiversal female Lombax, Naughty Dog literally crushed Joel's skull in with a golf club to make way for Ellie, and even Sucker Punch removed Jin Sakai in favor of Atsu, a far less interesting story in Ghost of Yotei. All of this happening and more, not to mention Intergalactic, another female-led game still coming, are being done under Hermen Hulst's leadership. Weirdly, all these games mimic the game that gave Hermen his ability to run PlayStation, which was Horizon. Bring in a female-led hero, even if it doesn't make sense, and push it like your life depends on it. Every decision made under Hermen has left PlayStation in a worse state than it was. Hermen also used his position to push Horizon as the verifiable blueprint of what he believes every Sony first-party franchise needs to be now. A female-led franchise that has multimedia potential for spin-offs, even if nobody wants it, like in Horizon's case with Lego or the VR stuff. Hermen's role as the CEO of Sony Studios is to expand Sony's IP into what I can only call universes meant to be mined for future content. He's also in charge of all of PlayStation's first-party games, even the publishing side, and development of these exclusive titles. Well, exclusive now since they went back to what they're doing before, I guess. But what Hermen has done to Sony and their catalog has, and I say this as straight as I can, been a total disaster. He has canceled live service games that likely at least would have made money, like Last of Us Factions, while believing that Horizon is still the future of the company almost 10 years after the release of the first game. So much so, Guerrilla remade Horizon 1 already, in case you don't know, and a TV show is even in the works for some reason around that game, as well as a third game is in active development for Horizon as well, all while Bloodborne of all things lays forgotten in a crypt somewhere in Sony's basement, while everybody wants that over literally anything with Horizon in its name instead. Under Hermen's guidance, studios like even Bluepoint, which did the Demon's Souls remake, were closed down after a cancelled God of War live service game was shut down that they were making, bizarrely greenlighted to be worked on by a studio completely comprised of developers who specialized in remaking games. Why was this even okayed in the first place? We have no idea. Hermen was also instrumental in Sony's acquisition and buying Bungie, believing that by owning the Destiny 2 development studio, Hermen and Sony could rely on Bungie to help them create other like-minded games. As we all know now, that is not the case. Bungie is a shell of itself after suffering mass layoff waves aplenty. Destiny 2, once the blueprint of live service, is dead and it will no longer receive new content. Yet Marathon, a blunder under Hermen Hulst's watch, again is being spearheaded as the future of Bungie, despite pulling in Concord numbers on the daily. Every single game that Hermen Hulst presided over that existed before his involvement are also arguably worse too. God of War Ragnarok is not as good as God of War 2018. Ghost of Yotei was not as well received as Tsushima despite the websites running damage control for it. Spider-Man 2 has become nothing less than a meme from fridges taking out Peter Parker of all things, Deaf Girl side missions, or even just sidelighting Peter outright in his own game with Miles Morales instead. Again, nowhere near as good as Spider-Man 2018. Even Horizon Forbidden West, Herman's baby, pales in comparison to the original, and with Wolverine on the horizon, the verdict is still out on that game, and whether Herman's influence has also ruined what should be a slam dunk easy win for Sony PlayStation. But since this video is being made before Wolverine releases, that's not something I can really add here as, of course, as an example. So we'll see with that one, I guess. But even Seros, a single player game under Herman's watchful eye, failed to also meet expectations, selling less than 500,000 copies in its debut release week. Another game where it's a humiliation ritual for the male players in favor of female supremacy. Thanks, Herman. Very cool again. Make no mistake that every single bad game post 2019, which is when Herman took over at Sony Studios from Shuhei Yoshida, has largely faltered and suffered under his control. Some were successes, sure, like a Helldivers 2 or an Astrobot, but these success stories do not outweigh the literal graveyards that are being left behind. I don't think that Herman is a bad person. I don't like seeing him fail either. I want nothing but for Sony PlayStation to return to their apex, but currently, as things are going, Sony's first-party offerings are becoming less seen as industry standards that everyone should be striving for, but instead, they're being seen as what to avoid at all costs. Every game, single-player-wise, besides Astrobot, somehow has worse writing, characters, messaging, and themes than what came before Hermen Hulst took over. I understand that the man spearheaded some big success stories, but Concord alone should have made Sony hit the panic button already. And ultimately, what we're being left with is a man that has been stretched far too thinly. He was seen and likely believed to be the Kevin Feige who runs the Marvel Cinematic Universe equivalent, but for Sony's first-party studios instead, but that hasn't been the reality. Every game, for the most part, has suffered under Hermen Hulst's control. The future of PlayStation's first-party exclusives all look like repeats of what already didn't work before. More female-led franchises, male heroes being erased from their own games, and a bigger push and focus on diversity, as well as live service elements over what made Sony the industry leader they used to be. Herman has effectively positioned Sony in a rather precarious position going forward now, with the PlayStation 6 on the horizon. Rumors of some hybrid-like system sort of akin to a Nintendo Switch 2 in Sony's future, and a focus on games as a service, like a Fair Games, which is still to come, or stuff like Horizon 3, I am not really excited nor supportive of Sony's future right now. Sony's first-party studios have released less games than ever in this current console generation than any before it. They've gutted their exclusivity in the name of chasing profits that never came. They dwindled and ruined the PlayStation brand because they wanted everything to be like Fortnite or Horizon. And more games have been greenlit and canceled, studios shut down, and institutional knowledge lost than ever before. And the only common denominator between this era of Sony and what came before under Shuhei Yoshida is Hermen Hulst was in control now. It's time for Sony to realize these mistakes will not correct themselves but repeat. And if Sony doesn't pivot soon, they may lose everything to Nintendo or Steam, who are doing better than they are in either fostering a much safer, more consumer-friendly ecosystem in Steam's case, or actually still offering physical first-party games, media, and actual regular first-party game releases in Nintendo's case, and not just canceling them outright like Sony does. But what is more evident and clear than ever is that this can no longer stand or continue the way that it's going. Hermen Hulst may have helped created Killzone, Horizon, and created amazing engines like Decima. He may have spearheaded Helldivers 2 to some capacity, but the losses left in his wake are too grave to ignore. Sony has to make a choice before it's too late, but that, my dear viewers, is the story of Hermen Hulst, the man who killed PlayStation. What do you think? Should I do more videos about other figures in video games like this? Let me know. This was a bit different, but I wanted to try something else. As always, thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to, and dear PlayStation, fix this before you lose everything. The ball is in your court. Let's hope you still know how to score, or there will be hell to pay.